Good evening. My name is Angela Laporte, and I'm the current Director of Art Education at the University of Arkansas School of Art. Welcome to the Art Education in Action lecture series, a virtual platform for art teachers in K-12 schools and community settings to share their approaches to social justice in art education. This lecture is supported by the Walton Family Charitable Support Foundation and the University of Arkansas Art Education Program. If you are attending this lecture for professional development credit, please contact me via email at alaporte@uark.edu, and I will provide the information you will need. My email will be in the chat in a few minutes. Before introducing our speaker, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional homelands and territories of the local indigenous peoples, including the Osage, Caddo, Quapaw nations, and where the University of Arkansas is currently located. A portion of the Trail of Tears runs through this campus where the Cherokee, Choctaw, Muskogee Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations passed through during a forced removal. By acknowledging the past, we recognize our responsibilities in relation to ongoing settler colonialism that eradicates indigenous peoples, cultures, and languages, as well as those colonial projects that dispossessed indigenous lands. This statement is an invitation to recognize indigenous presence now in our communities and to reckon possible ways to support indigenous survivance. Now I will introduce our guest speaker, Alice Costas. Alice is an artist, educator, and writer living and working in her beloved hometown, Chicago, Illinois. She came to the Chicago public school system from community arts organizations and has been trying to instill the ethos in her 10 years in the classroom, most of which have been at the high school she graduated from. She is a proud rank and file member of the Chicago Teachers Union, which is also her home base for community organizing. Outside of the classroom, she is passionate about contributing to creative and welcoming communities. The progressive and labor movements, theater and poetry, fiber arts, etc. Now let us welcome Alice Costas.
Thank you so much, Dr. Laporte. I'm so thrilled to be here and excited, and thank you for trusting me with this space. And I hope what I have to say is going to be useful. I also just want to acknowledge that art education is a very collaborative discipline. So like a lot of the ideas I'm going to talk about here came about in collaboration. I tried to credit people when I was like, oh, I definitely worked on this project with someone, but I'm sure I missed some. And also, again, like I think of our work as being from the collective in some ways. So I just want to acknowledge that. So does anyone have a scribble monster they want to share? Either a description or or holding one up to a camera? It's also okay if we don't want to share scribble monsters quite yet, or if they didn't happen yet. I do want to invite, if you want to make a few scribbles and turn them into a monster and give them a name, I want to invite that in kind of the name of opening this with a sense of play, because I think play opens us to bigger ideas and space to really think things through. So I think I'm going to keep moving just because I'm worried about time. I'm really tight on my time, but I please share scribble monsters as they appear. So we're also going to start with a quick opening exercise. We're talking about democracy, joy, and playfulness today, which are all very big conceptual things, and also things that I think we don't talk a lot about together. So I want to take a moment and try to actually embody some of those things. So think about how they feel physically, and especially think about them in the context of school. So I've got this prompt for you. You can draw, you can write, you can also just imagine your way through it. And as we start taking the time to write and think through it, I'm going to start narrating some questions to you that come from Linda Berry, who is an amazing comic book artist and educator. The trick here is to place yourself inside of the memory instead of making it something that happened before. So we're going to think of it as from the present. So it's not, I was in third grade, but we're going to work from, I am in Miss Rochelle's third grade classroom. So here we go. I want you to remember a time you felt agency and or joy. Both at once is fabulous if you've got that, but if you don't, no worries, during your education. If you didn't ever feel those things during your education, I want you to think of another memory where you have felt those things. So go ahead, take like a couple of seconds to think of a memory. And then I'm going to start posing questions. And again, you can write if you want, you can draw, you can also just think through it. So where are you in this memory? Are you inside or outside? If you're inside, what space are you inside of? What are you doing? What time of day or night does it seem to be? What season is it? Who else is there? About how old are you? What's directly in front of you? If you look to your left, what would be there? What about to your right? What's behind you? If you looked up above your head, what would you see? And what's beneath your feet? Can you remember any senses? So the smell of the space, any touches or feelings, sounds, tastes, sights. And then last of all, what's happening? Give yourself a minute to wrap up the imaginings. Go ahead and come back. So I want to open up the chat again. And I want to specifically hear, what was it like to feel joy or agency? Like what were some ways that you would describe that sensation? So I'm gonna pause for a second, let folks type some stuff in. Yeah, what was it like to return to that memory and to consider joy and agency in schools or classrooms or any other educational space? Calm, belonging, connectedness. Yeah. Yeah, it's like I feel like that feeling of certain classrooms feeling like home or like a safe space is really resonant for me. I think for me, I also think of feeling voice, feeling like my voice mattered, what I wanted mattered, which didn't always feel true in schools. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to keep going just in the interest of time, but please feel free to keep sharing. I would love to hear more about what the memories brought up. So who am I? So my name is Alice Costas, and like Dr. Laporte said in the introduction, I graduated from the school that I teach at. So this is my senior year ID photo. I've been teaching there for 10 years, and I still feel like very much in touch with this person and kind of what she longed for, where she felt seen, where she didn't. And also wanting to do right by her and what she needed as a teacher. Also knowing that there's lots of different ways to be in a classroom. It's really important to me as teachers that we have humility in a world where adults are kind of prioritized. And I think like when I see this face, I'm like, oh my gosh, yeah, I want to take care of that. Um, I was very much shaped by my teachers in my creative classrooms, as well as by Young Chicago Authors, which is an after-school gathering space for writers and artists in the city of Chicago. Oh, and I'm seeing all of these other beautiful responses, community and friendship, collaboration and fun. Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. Fun, right? I got a degree in creative writing, textiles, and American studies. And then after that, I started working in third spaces, so educational spaces that aren't school. So on the left, this is a photo of New Urban Arts. It's an after-school art center where the students actually hire the adults that work with them, and they just drop in and come make stuff. On the right, there's a photo of a postmodernist arts camp I used to work at that was just really goofy chaos. In both spaces, I did a lot of interdisciplinary work and performance-based work. And they both kind of had a big influence on my choice to re-enter the public school system out of wanting to create a space for those kind of experiences within classrooms. So my formal background is in fibers, but I also learned a lot through DIY and punk spaces. So stuff like zine making, very scrappy print making, building installations by like stapling stuffed animals to walls, not really knowing what you're doing, but using what you have. And now I make mostly collaborative and performance-based work, a lot of which is about teaching. So this is from a micro lecture I did as a part of a symposium that Jorge Lucero hosted about conceptual art and teaching and the ties between the two. I do a lot of print-based work and graphic design, most of which is based in my politics and community organizing purposes. So I'm trying to build really specific messages and make art that moves people. And then I'm also very active in my union, which is, in my opinion, one of the best demonstrations of the potential power of genuinely democratic spaces in the country. I'm also active in a bunch of community-based political organizations and local organizing networks in Chicago. So I teach at Northside College Prep. It's a selective enrollment high school on the northwest side of Chicago. What selective enrollment means in the Chicago public school system is you have to take a test and submit your grades to get in. The selective enrollment system is terrible for equity, and I always want to give people the context that it actually was enacted by a federal consent decree against the Chicago public school system to desegregate the school system. In fact, it actually made the problem much worse, right? So most selective enrollment schools, although not all of them, are quite diverse within the building, but they have made the neighborhood school system much, much more dramatically segregated. And I think it's a really good example of like power structures kind of maintaining themselves even when they say they're doing the opposite, right? The system is working exactly as it was designed to. One of the reasons I want to give this context is my students have more leeway than you might find in a lot of different places in the Chicago public school system. So I have dear friends who teach in places where there are much more kind of carceral systems of surveillance and limits on their students. For example, we do not have SROs or police officers in our school. We were the first Chicago public school to get rid of them, and it was basically a pretty easy conversation with our LSC. We showed up with evidence. There was a unanimous vote against it. Those conversations have been much more fraught and complicated in schools that are predominantly students of color, especially predominantly Black schools, and they are much more likely to have police in the building. So my students kind of enjoy this leeway to move through the school freely. A lot of kids aren't granted that. The other thing I want to talk about really quickly is when Northside was built, there was actually a big, very organized protest movement in the city against it. An alderman's child who lived in the neighborhood was about to enter high school, and he really pushed for getting the school built there. He got what he wanted. She was one of my classmates in high school. But at the same time, mothers and community organizers in Little Village on the southwest side actually went on a hunger strike, saying we need our own school and it should be just as well funded as the one up north. And they were successful in getting that school. So that's now social justice high. And I just think that's another thing that's really important to foreground is there's all this community struggle and building schools isn't neutral. So this is obviously really complicated for me. I teach in a school that I think really shouldn't exist. And it's also this really significant part of who I am in a place that I love. So when I started teaching, I started doing what I would describe as more traditional assignments with really specific goals, parameters, media. So this is a genius assignment my friend Lynn Yarn came up with, which is using negative space as a metaphor for block printing and specifically to highlight how it impacts history. So we have a piece about the Delano grape strike next to a fruit market. One kid dug up that Marcel Marceau, who was Jewish, was actually in the French resistance during World War II. And the first time he used his miming skills that he had been working on for years was to keep children quiet as he was smuggling them out of Nazi occupied France. Because students came from all over the city, we would talk a lot about neighborhoods. So here, coming up with a metaphor for a relic or the bones at the heart of your neighborhood, and then a very ornate container to hold them that reflected the community. And then Animal House, this is a project I actually started doing at camp. So building human scale installation sculptures that represent animals that build their own home. A very hip beaver dam, and then a beautiful bird's nest made out of stiffened yarn. So I don't think these are like bad projects. They're projects that administrators loved when they walked in, and I think the kids really enjoyed them. And I also don't think there isn't space for these kinds of projects in schools. But I was finding that I was still really engaging in these patterns of like the teacher controls the space, the students follow. And I felt like while I was teaching big ideas, I was still teaching compliance, right? Kids were looking for like the right answers. And there were really strict limits on what they can do. And that was decidedly not the reason I became a teacher. So at that same time, I was also finding myself drawn to these ways that students were creating work and space outside of the classroom and what teachers had asked them to do. So here's like the weirdest birthday locker decoration ever with like Thomas Jefferson and a medieval icon. This student actually had security let them into the art classroom early the morning David Bowie died to do this drawing because they knew the significance of him to the teachers and the other students. And then things that were actually openly transgressive. So we have this huge open house where like thousands of kids come from around the city to see the school. Everyone hates it. I asked the kids to draw the course map on the board, and they drew it getting like progressively smaller, sadder, the more advanced you get into each subject. Then probably the most transgressive image, taking this giant hand turkey we had done as a part of a buddy activity and pushing the other fingers down. This was about 3 feet high. A sneaky art is hard, I hate it, drawn on my board. Pet dogs, go to bed, neglect your work. So these kind of cheeky signs pushing against the academic pressure pot environment. And then I was also like transgressing too. So there's these terrible standardized tests we have to do at the beginning and the start of the year called the REACH exams. And they're just miserable. Like everyone, you look up and it's just like these kids like staring at you like in misery. They're doing a standardized test about art. It's awful. So we decided to draw smiley faces on paper plates and then tie them to our heads and called it Reach Face. So when you were taking the exam, if you looked up, you saw all these weird smiley faces staring back at you. Which is definitely not what CPS wants you to be doing, but we did bring them back at the end of the year, so the testing environment was the same both times. So all of this led me to start looking into what makes an authentically democratic classroom. And I want to pause here and reflect on what that might mean. So in the chat, if we remove the electoral process from the equation, what does democracy mean to you? What does it look like in action, and what does it look like in spaces that are not political? So go ahead and take a second to think about this and type some reflections in the chat. Actions and culture are dictated by the people in the spaces. Yeah. Making invisible structures visible. Yep. Being really explicit about what's happening. Everyone has a voice. Beautiful. Everyone having a say, an equal voice or opinion, having a voice. These are beautiful. Yeah. And for me, what it comes down to is that everyone in the room is involved in decisions about how to best meet their needs. And those needs might be educational, but they also might be related to emotional or physical well-being and all of these other things that kind of build our world beyond just what's the explicit objective or goal. Please keep sharing. I know that was quick, so if you have more thoughts and time to reflect, please do so. So I want to share this clip of this incredible interview that Tupac, the rapper, actually did when he was 17. There were documentary filmmakers in his school. They coincidentally got this half-hour-long interview with him. It's amazing. You should watch the whole thing, but he does talk explicitly about school. So I'm going to go ahead and play about a minute and a half of this. And I think it's very much about how democratic processes work or don't work so much in schools generally.
Well, oh, I hope I don't get in trouble, but school is, I think that we got so caught up in school being a tradition that we stopped using it as a learning tool, which it should be. Like, up to this day, I mean, school should be, I think there should be a different curriculum in each and every, like, neighborhood, you know? Because I'm going to Tamalpais High, and I'm learning about the basics, but they're not basic for me, you know? And it's like, they're not, to get us ready for today's world, that's not helping. It's just what they took, so it's what we're gonna take, you know? And that's why the streets have taught me. And but school is really important, reading, writing, arithmetic. But I think after you learn reading, writing, and arithmetic, that's it. But what they tend to do is teach you reading, writing, and arithmetic, then teach you reading and writing and arithmetic again, then again, just making it harder and harder, just so, to keep you busy. And that's where I think they messed up. There should be a class on drugs. There should be a class on sex education, a real sex education class, not just pictures and diaphragms and unlogical terms and things like that. There should be a drug class. There should be sex education. There should be a class on scams. There should be a class on religious cults. There should be a class on police brutality. There should be a class on apartheid. There should be a class on racism in America. There should be a class on why people are hungry, but they're not. Their classes on gym, you know, physical education. Let's learn volleyball because one day we're gonna, you know, it's their classes like algebra, where I've yet to go to a store and said, can I have X, Y plus 2 and give me my Y change back? Thank you. You know, I think you could let me out. I've lived alone by myself, and the things that helped me were the things that I learned from my mother and from the streets. And reading has helped me. I mean, school has taught me reading, which is I love reading, writing, and arithmetic. That's it. Like foreign languages. I think they're important, but I don't think it should be required because actually they should be teaching you English and then teaching you how to understand double talk, politicians double talk, not teaching you how to understand French and Spanish and German. When am I going to Germany? I can't afford to pay my rent in America.
So I think he's so brilliant. He actually goes on about school for another 2 minutes or so. And at the end of it, he says, I work 20 hours after school. So between school and what I'm doing afterwards, I'm working 40 hours a week, but no one respects me as an adult. And I think part of creating democratic spaces in our classrooms is actually also having the space where we respect the whole and round world our students are occupying, and literally making space for that in the classroom, right? Saying like, we respect that you are living this experience. You have an immense amount of thoughts about what agency or agency you don't have in terms of making it that part of the curriculum. So this is the Center for Nonviolent Communications inventory of universal human needs. They posit that when violence occurs, it's usually because some of these needs aren't being met. So, pardon me, I'd like you to take a second, look at it, and think about which of these needs seemed really important and were being met at your school and which maybe were not. Feel free to just drop a running list in the chat and just so you know, there's a whole second slide of this list coming. So there's much more needs to look at. But for example, when I think about connection, all of that list, all of those things, like what a super important part of school and being educated, right? But of course, that's not what we're officially there for. That's not what we're tested on. So a lot of times those things get ignored. But I want acceptance and compassion to be a part of my pedagogy and what happens in my classroom. I'm going to give about 30 seconds to read through the list. And then here's the next part of the list. Similarly, if I'm going to deny any of these, I want to think really hard about it. So for example, I don't see a good reason not to let kids eat in my class. So usually it's okay. Conversely, if we're doing something that's going to make eating dangerous, so if that physical safety becomes a threat under the physical well-beings, for example, glazing clay, that's toxic, we're not going to allow eating in there because one need supersedes the other. But it's all a balancing act, right? And I want to have humility and perspective and space for me also as a person who's occupying the space, and the ability to be honest and communicate about where I come short here. Like that's something I want to be in communication with my students with too. All of which is, again, making space to be a whole person in the classroom. So here's where I'm going to start talking about joy and tenderness as a way to facilitate the democratic process, because the fact is governing is radically impacted by our emotional and physical states of being, even though people with power are usually pretty loath to acknowledge that, and that it's not all logic and fact, right? So that extends to our people who are in charge, our politicians, but that's also true, I think, in smaller situations of who holds power. So I want to show 3 quick examples that actually deviate from formal art making. The first is a super early example in my teaching career. My friend Emily was in town, and usually if I have a friend who is in town who's an artist, which Emily is, I see if they want to come in and do a one-off lesson at school. And Emily was like, yeah, totally, but I'm actually a bike mechanic now, so could I come in and teach the kids how to true or straighten the wheel of a bike? And I was like, let me check with them. So I asked the kids, and they were like, yeah. And then I was like, so, and then after she teaches us that, we can make art about it later. And they were like, or we could just learn that, because that's a good thing to know. And I was like, oh, right. So Emily came to school, taught the kids how to true a bike wheel. I think it was a very, I think it was a very profound thing, but it was also a really profound thing for me as a teacher, right? To be like, it's okay to make space for just learning these things that are good to know. I'm someone who had an absolutely terrible time during the pandemic, and during a meeting with my colleagues who were co-teaching with me, I said something along the lines of, when we were getting pushed back into the classrooms before we felt totally safe, if we just hatched baby chickens, I think it'll be okay. Thinking of like a kindergarten classroom. So my dear friend Joanne went out of her way to make that possible, and we ended up having art class chickens. This is us candling eggs for signs of life. I think it's one of the most beautiful and precious things. We would pull kids over to look at it. And then when the eggs actually started hatching, they would come by and just kind of watch them wiggle and shake, and then get very exhausted from the process of being born. We had this whole system for how to name them, which was you had to do a completed coloring book sheet with a name on it, and then we had a giant vote. So they had wild names: tax evasion, isopropyl alcohol, demon incinerator 3000. We made little dioramas to take photos of them in. And then we would just bring them into classes, right? And let kids like play with them while they were taking a breather from doing whatever they were doing. So here's a kid who really wanted to touch the bird, but was scared of getting germs. So petting it with her little sweatshirt arm. Kids have a fake onion Instagram. So they wrote, "Art room chicks report burnout after being held by hundreds of students looking for just an ounce of joy in their life." And like that's dark, but I think there was some truth to that. Like we essentially ended up with what became like emotional support animals for the entire school. So there were like thousands of kids just dropping in, being like, "Can I hold a chicken?" And us being like, "Yeah, sure, here's a chicken," and kind of stopping everything to do that. They crocheted little hats for them too, which was wonderful. Incontestable tacos, I was doing this unit with my digital imaging class where we were looking at contests, because I was getting like 10 emails a day from all of these corporations being like, "Can you make, oh, Joanne, you just missed the chickens. Hi." 10 emails a day being like, "Can your kid make this Microsoft contest image, and it's worth like $50 if you win first prize," or whatever. And I just thought that was so weird. I was like, why does IBM want my students to make a very specific artwork for like a sum of money that's meaningful to them, but like very meaningless to the corporation? And then the kids kind of like turned it on its head and were like, "Miss Costas, what if we stopped doing contest stuffs and we turned it into making the best tacos in the world collectively? And it's actually about avoiding contests." And I was like, "Oh yeah, duh." So we made this giant kind of brainstorm about what us making tacos together meant. And then they like organized gathering the materials, they got hot plates, and then we made some really incredible tacos together. We had a green screen set up, and those are the best images of this, but I can't show you them because the best part is the kids' faces, and the kids' faces I have to cover. So unfortunately, we're going to have to suffice for smiling kids making a lot of really delicious tacos. So what I'm thinking about with all of this is that if we create space where we can be human together, and that's like the actual goal of the activity, that can be a really transformative thing in schools, because they are actively structured to discourage this in many ways. But in fact, it's like the only and the most important thing in a lot of ways. Like, how can we teach each other to be vulnerable, to be kind, to be communicative, to work through conflict together? I also want to talk about the physical space of the art room. So, because I think that can become a big way that kids take ownership of space. So this is the room. Students have open access to the materials in here. I told them all to cover their faces, so it's a really weird photo. My brilliant student teacher from a few years ago who is here turned to me one day and said, "I just realized that the art room is a giant collaborative installation that takes place over decades." And I was like, yeah, I never realized that either, but that's very true and profound. So here is a little censored version of The Birth of Venus that a kid made. And then a tiny tapestry that another one gave me, a magnet a colleague gave me. And then the other thing that's really cool about that point Jackie made is that that implies that there's lineages of teachers. So I think a lot about my giant educational family tree, the different educators who occupied this space, and also how can I be like a good, goofy educational ancestor to the people I share the space with. So like seeing lots of like beloved colleagues and student teachers in the chat, and just I hope I'm doing right by that. So here is a paper net sculpture of Yoda that my colleague and former teacher Chris left in the ceiling. And like sometimes I'll like genuinely look at it for guidance and be like, Yoda, what should I do? This is my former teacher and amazing professor, Jorge Lucero's stapler that got glued to the ceiling in a prank along with everything on his desk. That's the only thing that got left up there. It's been there for almost 20 years. I get asked about it more than basically anything in the room. Jorge also collaged and painted our clock after it broke. There's no working clock in the room, and I kind of like that. I think in some ways art time should be abstract in an art room. My colleague Lindsay Capeless got really into macrame for a while and was like suspending all these things from the ceiling, and then we started doing that with students too. So we've got old broken remotes and Godzillas in here. And then Chris Santiago, who also put the Yoda up, also on his way. When he knew he was leaving the school, he took a bunch of seniors and made paintbrushes out of their hair and his hair and hid them under a ceiling tile. So we got to unearth them for this. They're called the Barber's Collection, and they have these wonderful silly names like Lil Destroyer, Grecian, Fruitcake. We put them back. They're still there. Here's kind of a mishmash of stuff I've made and hung up, stuff kids have made and hung up, trying to make the room a welcoming space. Here's a poster from the ACT collective that Dr. Camacho is a part of. So proud, and I love saying Dr. before her name. So proud to have that in the room. Raw wool students are processing to make yarn out of in the sink. And then this like wonderful object that the student who made identified with. So it's a piñata. So after it got destroyed, we like reconstituted it and hung it from the ceiling. Here's a hall pass a kid made herself to visit my class from another art class that was going on. A little technique sample. And then these are 2 drawings that the social worker's 7-year-old did. And basically what these serve is if a kid's saying really crappy stuff about their own artwork, they can go over and look at those and think, would I say these things to this lovely 7-year-old who made these beautiful images? And if the answer is no, they gotta find different language to talk about the work they're making. And then the classroom also becomes a space to kind of make and add art into it for the students. So this is our pet rock, also from Lindsay Capeless. But this little plaque in front of it and this banner are added from a project that we do called Learning to Love You More, which is inspired by Miranda July and Harrell Fletcher, who started the Learning to Love You More project. So they basically wrote very basic assignments about human connection, and then that had like a visual or written output, and then shared everything everyone turned in on their website. So this was make an inspirational banner, write an informational plaque, photograph a scar and write about it. I happened to carry a huge rock with the help of a friend. It was all going well until we lost grip of the rock, so we dropped the rock on my leg, and that left a huge cut on my leg near my ankle. I had to go to the nurse's office, but at the time there wasn't a nurse at school. Should have been a nurse at school. Funding. But so Mr. Finelli, who was the principal at the time, helped as well, or the assistant principal. Afterwards, I just had to explain what happened to me, and it went down so Mr. Finelli could report it. Document your bald spot, make a paper replica of your bed. And then the kids started coming up with their own versions of these assignments. So this is a giant map of where they were in the room, in the building, that you could go and find different assignments. So this is called Spirit of Rom. We had a terrible mayor who committed the largest mass school closing in American history, closed 54 schools at one time. So there is this photo of him photoshopped onto a gymnast, and the assignment was to make an altar to him made entirely out of materials found in a public school. Boxed in, fit yourself into little spaces in the school and photograph it. Jorge's hair, there was a kid in the class named Jorge who just had like the most beautiful hair in the world, and the assignment was to make your hair look as much like Jorge's as possible. So part of what I want to make clear is that making art is actually really hard, like that little drawing I found on the board that said art is hard and I hate it, which is why play and joy is so important. So there's not actually room to talk about heavy stuff if you don't feel safe, like you're a part of the community, like you have a role in the decision making, and that you can meet your own human needs. So play is also doing something quite serious, which is prying apart the space to make our problems and struggles more explicit and something we can work through. And one of the ways we can do that is through making art. So I want to go through a bunch of assignments that we can do after we've made that creative space. So this is the imaginary friend assignment with my wonderful co-teachers who we all teach Art 1 together. I love that Flora says tears on it. And Jackie also helped teach this one. So that's a nice little thing in there. A lion. This kid said that the most reliable friend in her life was math. So she made a theta that is kind of like animate for her, which I think is beautiful. This butterfly that the kid figured out how to make it move, and it carries the mountains with it. And then guerrilla art is a project we do where students, the entire guideline is basically you have to make an art that is site specific and you have to actually install it in that spot. They make all sorts of stuff. So this is a transformation of our recycling bin about global warming. These kids made work. Oh, a beautiful piece about a student's mom who ran a hair salon and is a hairdresser, and just feeling like she was feeling so much stress from the pandemic and not getting any credit for it. So wanting to extend some care for her by making this sculpture. There are no urinal dividers in our school. The kids don't like that. So they made these urinal dividers themselves that say the reasons there should be urinal dividers. Asbestos cereal installed in an actual grocery store. Buy less, choose well, make it last. She made this shirt and then installed it in an actual shop. Obsession is a project I do with my fibers students because we do repetitive motions in most parts of fiber art. So it kind of leads into that. So here we've got an obsession with that. And really, like, again, they can make whatever they want. It has to do with the overall theme of obsession. If they really don't want to work with that theme, they can propose something else. So an obsession with death, an obsession with spaces you keep finding yourself in on the right. An obsession with the image of an Ouroboros or a snake eating its own tail. Hospitality, in this case, oranges were a symbol of hospitality in the students' culture. An obsession with repetitive use injuries from crocheting over and over, and then a similar image and color scheme, but very different message, feeling like you're carrying the weight of the world in your family. Perfectionism, getting good grades. Try harder. I have to do better. 98%, 89s, A's and B's. The Gaze is a project I co-taught with Lindsay Capeless. So this was about the idea of the gaze, starting with feminist film theory of the male gaze, but also expanding outwards into the security state and all of the ways we encounter kind of surveillance. So we've got warning, recording, and process about the cameras all over the schools. This piece about bees and how kind of the way we relate to the natural environment both separates us from it while trying to honor it, and that ultimately leads to some really terrible things like creating whole cities that are very inhospitable to bees and leading to their potential extinction. School shootings, and then a really beautiful piece about a cousin who had moved and she was following her through social media primarily. So like kind of through this mitigated lens that wasn't direct contact. Relationship stories is a project I do with digital imaging where they can use any narrative art form they want. And they're going to tell some sort of a story about the idea of relationship. So it can be the concept of relationship, it can be research into different aspects of relationship, or it can be about a specific relationship. So I'm going to show you two of these. They're both stop motion pieces in this case. This one's about a cousin who passed away. Okay, and then I think I'm actually going to skip the next one in the interest of time. So the other thing I want to talk about is big collaborative processes that actually require a lot of negotiation and engaging in consensus building. So these are both projects that were directed towards children at an all-school kind of art event we would have where we open the school up to the community. This was a communal coloring book that Digital Imaging made. We decided on the themes, feelings on the moon, and then kind of like cannibalized a bunch of different coloring books into Illustrator to create these images. So it's okay to be sad on the moon. Stay Puft Marshmallow Man demonstrates anger. And then amazing, courageous person, Kesha is feeling strong on the moon. Sesame Street Train is, this was a project we actually did right after a student of ours was killed in what was essentially a drive-by shooting. So I think we needed a lot of comfort. We were making films for children. We ended up deciding to do Sesame Street segments with a specific theme. In this case, the kids decided on the Chicago Transit Association. So I'm just going to play a few seconds of each of these.
The orange line runs just fine from the airport to the southwest side. The pink line is quite nice too, from Cermak to the downtown loop.
So trying to teach kids different train lines, this really nice experiential piece about just like filming what it's like to be on the train. And then a little animation of some ghosts, which I think is very much in the spirit of Sesame Street, which really is like a big kind of democratic film experiment where you're seeing a bunch of different people's experiments strung between these segments and skits of the puppets. Last thing I want to show is 20-hour project. So this is the end of the final project for each of our classes. This is across the art department, across Northside Prep's history. Where students make a project that is literally just whatever they want. It needs to be a concise, consolidated project that takes roughly 20 hours. So some embroidery about patterns in nature writ small, beautiful photographs of a student's neighborhood. We're going to skip this one, but it's a great animation about architecture and architectural history and how humans interact with it. Growing up too fast. Protest work in honor of each of the Tibetan monks who have self-immolated in protest of the Chinese occupation of Tibet. Work about seeing tenderness and beauty in the students' friends that she felt they were being denied in the greater world because of stereotypes about men of color. Wolves in sheep's clothing in the style of classic Vogue covers. A food card about biracial identity and sharing foods of different cultures. What would a stuffed animal's insides look like? Politicians who have said absolutely hideous things about immigration, and in this case, building a wall in the context of the actual results of those actions. Attachment types. How do we make relationships with others? Embroidered patches for specific friends, using your phone screen as a way of telling a kind of self-portrait or a digital self-portrait, wanting the world to see your friends with the regal importance you see them with, gifts about anxiety, and then who am I in this vast universe? So 2 lessons I want to end on. One, make room for pomegranates. Last year, this kid came with 2 pomegranates he had been given at the end of his shift working at a grocery store. He had no idea how to eat them. It was in the middle of class. So me and his friends got together. I taught them how to break it in water like my papu taught me. And then we ate them and shared them with the class. It was the first time a lot of kids had had pomegranates. So making space for those experiences. And then I'm actually going to end with, so sometimes kids will do research questions and then do a bunch of research, present on it, and use that as a jumping off point to make art. This is actually Joanne Mignot, who is here's daughter Natasha's research on the question, how to be satisfied with your life. Make your life more ordered, maybe. Join a group, make some rules, be definitive, ascribe to systems, have babies, or maybe an animal, make friends or significant others, start a strict hobby, make lists. Make your life less ordered, maybe. Destroy some things, defy some ideas, be loosely descriptive, disregard rules, become solitary, allow wandering, be impulsive, ask questions in the opposite places. One can make answers for oneself, but not for other people. Definitive answers are satisfying but rare. Some questions have no answers. Asking the important questions is sometimes more helpful than giving the important answers. I cannot tell you what is best to do for yourself. Okay, and I went over, but we have a few minutes for questions now. I'm so sorry for going over.
Does anyone have a question?
And also just thank you, lots of people. Thank you everyone for being here. I really appreciate just, seeing a lot of both new and familiar faces and people who have been really important in how I learn and teach.
Yes, thank you so much. You sure no one has a question before we end this session?
We can wait too.
I don't know how accessible or answerable this is for you because I don't know exactly like the entirety of like what you've taught throughout the many years outside of teaching at Northside. But I went from Northside being kind of my first teaching experience at all, which was just so joy-filled and so like we were able to give so much of that. There was a lot of room for democracy in the classroom without feeling like the classroom was falling into chaos. And I went from teaching there to teaching K through 12. I literally teach 18-year-olds and sometimes like 4 or 5-year-olds. And I guess I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or ideas on how to have that same kind of openness and freedom and democracy and kind of student-led curricula with much younger children.
So I had a really hard time teaching really little people because I felt like I was asking them to do things that were developmentally inappropriate and like I was exercising a lot of control. But I think like my first thought would be going back to that inventory of human needs and like if like, you know, you have to have the priority of safety, of connection. If there's stuff that's interrupting that, there does need to be like a certain amount of binding together. And I think like also like part of our job is to kind of like teach how to live in that moment of like communal responsibility, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like I think like when people are very young, a lot of times our models for that aren't great. And maybe like just modeling some of the safe chaos and then talking about Nicole, who's here, shows this amazing thing called, I think it's like human mammalian diving impulse, where like kids give people haircuts and they're just literally allowed to do whatever they want. Like, I think there are situations you can set up like that, probably. I don't know, you know, that's your own visions and dreams, but I think there are ways to kind of introduce it in. Ooh, Gabby, yeah, dream big. And like, I think like Nicole, another thing that Nicole said that was very impactful to me when I was learning to be a teacher is like having a classroom is like having a SAC collective of artists. So I think like thinking about it from that space of potential where like we're all working as a collective and supporting each other is in like realizing visions, but like letting that open possibilities instead of being like, oh my gosh, I have like 30 kids, it's too much. Like that, I do that all the time, but like my best moments are the moments when I'm like, there's 30 kids here. What can we do that we couldn't do if there were like 15 kids in the room? And I think also being open to like collaboration with other educators, other people's ideas, like almost everything I showed today comes from a collaborative place. So Nabi, I steal a lot from Art 21, right? Like a lot of the ideas are like stuff that either like came from other artists or like I'll see an art piece I work on, I like that I really love and be like, oh, like what would that look like if 30 kids were playing with the same idea and making? So I feel like, yeah, but I think borrowing big ideas is where they come from a lot. And then like sometimes it'll just be like, I've been thinking about this thing a lot, and I think probably other people might want to think about it because usually if we're fixated on one thing, it's something that's coming up for other people too. And like maybe we could think about it together. Thank you, Ashley. And also like you, right? I feel like Nambia and I work together, and I feel like part of, you know, I feel like you have brilliant ideas and we all have these ideas and are sharing with them with each other. Oh, thanks, Gabby. I don't know the answer to that though, but I think maybe YouTube.
Oh, it will be on University of Arkansas YouTube. Yes. I can share that with you.
Oh, thank you.
Well, I think that wraps things up, unless someone else has a burning question. Oh, what was that other art lesson
Yeah,
website?
Lindsay. Totally. Yeah. So the imaginary friends are from that's oh my gosh. I know her name, but I can't remember what it's called. It's Sarah Ernest Green, who's the lead curator, the artist I met. Yeah. The lead curator at the Indianapolis Museum of Art, who has these amazing assignments that are like by artists directed towards students. Yeah, really, really good resource.
All right, well, that concludes this session, and thank you very much for presenting. There were a lot of good ideas that you shared with everyone, and hopefully we'll continue to be democratic in our teaching, right?
Yeah. Thank you.
Stop the recording. Thanks everyone for coming.